They told her she was a ghost before she was even dead. Too old, too plain, too barren. A walking collection of everything a man in the West didn't want. Evelyn May Porter stood on the dusty train platform in Bent Willow, New Mexico, feeling the judgment of 100 unseen eyes. The journey had taken 6 days. 6 days of rattling bones and coal smoke, all fueled by a single flimsy hope. A hope that was currently staring at her like she was a spoiled side of beef. His name was Thomas Whitley, the man who'd paid her passage, the man whose letters promised a life built on steadiness, not youth. He was tall, dressed in a fine coat that didn't belong in this dusty town, and his face was a mask of cold disappointment. He didn't even have the decency to speak to her directly. He turned to the stagecoach driver, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. "Take her back." Just like that. A life dismissed. A future erased. The hope she'd carried all the way from Ohio shattered into a million tiny pieces right there on the splintered boardwalk. The driver looked at her with a flicker of pity, but Thomas Whitley didn't look at her at all. He just turned and walked away, his polished boots kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to mock her very existence. They said no man would want a home without a legacy, that a woman was only as good as the sons she could provide. And in a world that measured worth in cradles and crops, Evelyn was deemed empty. But they were wrong. She was full of something else, something they couldn't see. A quiet strength forged in the silence of loss, a tenderness that only comes after the world has tried its best to break you. She could have withered right there. She could have let the shame swallow her whole. But as she stood alone, the return ticket clutched in her hand like a death sentence, something happened. A man appeared out of the shimmering heat. He wasn't polished like Thomas Whitley. He was weathered, his hands calloused, his eyes holding a sorrow so deep it seemed to drink the sunlight. And he wasn't empty-handed. Cradled on his hip, wrapped in a thin, dusty blanket, was a baby. He walked right up to her, his gaze unwavering. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was standing there alone, a ghost on a forgotten platform. He just placed the feverish child into her arms, and in a voice rough with desperation, he whispered a single, life-altering sentence. "She needs a mother." And in that moment, as the tiny, whimpering child settled against her chest, the world shifted on its axis. A woman cast aside for being too old, too empty, had just been handed a new beginning. But this was no simple act of mercy. This was the start of something far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. Because the man wasn't just a stranger, and the baby was a secret that could get them all killed. Evelyn froze, the weight of the child in her arms, both a shock and a strange, distant comfort. The baby was burning up, her small body radiating a dry, desperate heat. Her breaths were shallow, coming in tiny, ragged puffs. This wasn't just a summer flu. This was something deep, something urgent. "I'm not a doctor," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. The words felt foolish as soon as they left her lips. Of course she wasn't a doctor. She was a rejected bride, a seamstress from Ohio, with nothing to her name but a packed suitcase and a ticket back to nowhere. The stranger knelt, his eyes never leaving hers. They were a startling gray, like a stormy sky, and they held the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "I know what you're not," he said, his voice low and steady. "But you're still here. You didn't run." It was true, she hadn't. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to give the baby back, to retreat into the shell of her own misery. But she couldn't. The child's tiny fingers had curled around the fabric of her shawl, a grip so weak yet so determined, it felt like an anchor. "My name is Caleb," the man said, his gaze dropping to the sleeping child. "Caleb Rourke, this little one. This is Josie." He paused, and the grief that had been hiding in the corners of his eyes flooded forward. Her ma passed on 6 days ago. 6 days, the same number of days Evelyn had spent on the train, dreaming of a new life. While she was moving toward a future, this child's world had been torn apart. He explained that Josie's mother was a Sioux woman, taken in by his family during a raid years ago. Now both her parents were gone, and he'd promised to see the child to safety. The story was tragic, but it felt rehearsed. Too neat. There was a piece missing, a jagged edge to his words that didn't quite fit. Evelyn rocked the baby, a gentle, instinctive motion she didn't know she possessed. Josie's whimpering subsided, and she sank into a heavy, feverish sleep against Evelyn's chest, as if she recognized a safety that Evelyn herself didn't feel. Caleb's expression softened, just for a second. "You hold her so steady," he murmured, and the word hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Steady! It was the exact word Thomas Whitley had used in his letter. "I ain't looking for young. I'm looking for steady." He'd written those words, summoned her across a continent, and then discarded her because the lines around her eyes didn't match the fantasy in his head. And now here was another man, a stranger with a world of sorrow on his shoulders, seeing in her the very thing the other had rejected. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice firm, cutting through the haze of shock. "Honestly, ma'am, I don't rightly know," Caleb admitted, running a hand through his dusty, wheat-colored hair. A long, jagged scar traced the line of his jaw, a white line against his sun-darkened skin. "I've got a wagon, a sick baby, and a cabin that hasn't known a woman's touch in a long, long time. I wasn't looking for help, but I'll take it if you offer." This was her choice. The stagecoach would be back in the morning. She could get on it, return to the gray, suffocating life of the factory in Ohio, and let this moment become just another sad story she told herself at night. Or she could step into the unknown. She could take this desperate man and his sick child and walk into a life she never asked for. A life that might be even harder, even lonelier than the one she left behind. But as she looked down at the child, at the trusting weight of her in her arms, Evelyn knew it wasn't really a choice at all. Her old life was over. Thomas Whitley had seen to that. This was something new, something terrifying, something real. She looked up, meeting Caleb's gaze. She gave a single sharp nod. "I'll come." The journey into the wilderness began at sunrise, but as the familiar sight of bent willow disappeared behind them, Evelyn couldn't shake a chilling thought. Caleb had said Josie's mother died 6 days ago. He'd found Evelyn standing alone, rejected and vulnerable, at the exact moment he needed someone. It was too perfect, too much of a coincidence. And it begged the question, what really happened to Josie's mother? And why did Caleb look less like a grieving savior and more like a man on the run? The ride to Caleb's homestead was a long, suffocating silence. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other. It was the tense, watchful silence of two strangers bound by a desperate circumstance, each waiting for the other to reveal their true nature. Evelyn held Josie tight, the child's fever a constant, worrying presence against her skin. She'd managed to cool her forehead with a damp cloth from Caleb's canteen, but the heat still lingered deep within the baby's small frame. Caleb never spoke. He just drove the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, one hand on the reins, the other resting near the worn leather handle of a pistol tucked into his belt. He wasn't just watching for snakes or bandits. He was watching for something specific, something he expected to find. Every time a dust devil spun across the plains, his shoulders would tense. Every time a hawk cried overhead, his hand would tighten on his gun. Evelyn had lived a quiet life, but she knew the look of a hunted man. And Caleb Rourke was a hunted man. Finally, after hours that stretched into an eternity, they crested a ridge. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley, was a cabin. It was a sad, lonely sight. The roof sagged in the middle, the chimney was stained black with years of smoke, and the garden was a tangle of dead weeds. But there was a single wooden chair on the porch, facing west, as if someone had been waiting for a sunset that never came. "It ain't much," Caleb said, his voice raspy from disuse, "but it's safe." Safe! The word hung in the air, feeling like a lie. Evelyn looked from the run-down cabin to the man beside her, a man who bristled with tension and secrets. What did safe even mean out here, in a place that felt like the edge of the world? Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, old smoke, and a profound, lingering grief. It was clean but stark. A rough-hewn table, two chairs, a stone hearth. In the corner, covered by a simple cloth, sat a cradle. It was beautifully made, The wood sanded smooth, but it was empty, unused. A woman's shawl, a deep crimson wool, hung on a peg by the door. Evelyn didn't ask about it. She didn't ask about the cradle. She knew some questions were too heavy to be answered with words. The story of this place was written in the silence, in the things that were missing. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet labor. Evelyn fell into a rhythm born of necessity. She aired out the musty cabin, scrubbed the floors, and found a small stash of dried herbs. Feverfew, yarrow, chamomile. She boiled them into a tea, forcing a few precious drops between Josie's pale lips every hour. She worked with a focused desperation, pouring all her rejected hope, all her frayed tenderness, into this one small, fragile life. Caleb worked outside. He mended fences that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. He chopped a mountain of firewood. He moved with a relentless energy, as if physical exhaustion was the only thing that could keep his demons at bay. They barely spoke. Their interactions were a series of gestures. He would leave a bucket of fresh well water by the door. She would leave a bowl of hot stew on the table for him when he came in, long after the sun had set. But Evelyn watched him. She noticed things. She noticed he never ever looked at the cradle. His eyes would slide right past it, as if it were invisible. He never touched the crimson shawl. But most telling of all, every evening, he would climb the small hill behind the cabin and stand for a long time before a single, unmarked wooden cross hammered into the earth. He wasn't just grieving for the Sioux woman he'd mentioned. This was different. This was the grief of a husband. One night, unable to sleep, Evelyn was rocking Josie by the dying fire when Caleb finally came inside. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face carved deeper by the flickering light. He sat down heavily in the other chair, the silence stretching between them. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice soft. "Josie's fever is worse," Evelyn replied, her own voice tight with worry. "The tea isn't enough. There's a rattling in her chest now. She needs a proper doctor." Caleb stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "There's no doctor for 100 miles, and we can't go back to Bent Willow." "Why not?" Evelyn pressed, her patience finally snapping. "What are you so afraid of, Caleb? Who are you hiding from?" He finally looked at her, and his stormy gray eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded pain. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked one of his own. "The man who sent for you," he said slowly, deliberately. "The one in town. His name was Thomas Whitley, wasn't it?" Evelyn's blood ran cold. She had never mentioned the name. Not once. How did he know? The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the stone hearth. The sound was deafening in the sudden, ringing silence. Caleb knew Thomas Whitley's name. He knew who she was, who she had come for, and he hadn't said a word. The entire story about the Sioux woman, the promise to get the child to safety, it was all starting to feel like a carefully constructed lie. "How do you know that name?" Evelyn asked, her voice low and dangerous. She pulled the sleeping Josie closer to her, a protective instinct she didn't know she had flaring to life. Caleb let out a long, ragged breath, the sound of a man surrendering a secret he'd held for too long. "Because Thomas Whitley," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "is my brother." The confession hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. His brother. The man who had humiliated her. The man who had cast her aside like trash. Was this man's brother. She had been plucked from her despair by the family of her tormentor. It wasn't a rescue. It was a transaction. She had been passed from one Whitley brother to the other. "You lied to me," she whispered, the accusation sharp with betrayal. "I told you what you needed to hear," Caleb countered, his voice defensive. "I saw you on that platform. I saw what he did to you. I knew you had nowhere to go, and I was desperate." "Desperate for what? A free nurse for this baby?" The anger was hot in her throat, a bitter, burning bile. All her care, all her worry for Josie, now felt cheapened, used. "No!" he shot back, his voice cracking. He stood up, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. "Thomas, he's not a good man, Evelyn. He's greedy. He's cruel. He takes what he wants and discards the rest. People, land, promises. It's all the same to him." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression pleading. I needed to get Josie away from him, away from Bent Willow, away from his influence. He would have, I don't know what he would have done with her. Sent her away. Worse. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture far uglier than she had imagined. Josie, Evelyn said, looking down at the child, she isn't the daughter of some Sioux woman you took in, is she? Caleb flinched, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. He slowly shook his head. Then who is she? Evelyn demanded. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He stared at the empty cradle in the corner, and the grief he'd been holding back finally broke through. She's his, Caleb choked out. Josie is Thomas Whitley's daughter. My God. The baby she was holding, the child she had been pouring her heart into, was the daughter of the man who had tried to destroy her. This whole situation was a twisted knot of family secrets and lies. But there was still one piece that didn't fit. The grave on the hill, the crimson shawl. And her mother? Evelyn asked, her voice soft now, dreading the answer. Caleb finally turned, and the look in his eyes was one of utter devastation. Her name was Elora, he whispered, and she was meant to be my wife. The confession shattered the last of Evelyn's assumptions. Elora. She was supposed to marry Caleb, but she'd had a child with his brother, Thomas. A story as old as time, a betrayal that cut to the bone. No wonder Caleb was a haunted man. He was living in the wreckage of his own life, raising the child of his brother and the woman he loved. But Josie's fever was getting worse. The rattle in her chest was louder, more pronounced. Whatever family tragedy had brought them here, it wouldn't matter if the child didn't survive the night. The story doesn't matter right now, Evelyn said, her voice regaining its steady, practical tone. This child is sick, Caleb. Truly sick. I've done all I can. If we don't get her to a doctor, she will die. Caleb's face was a mask of despair. I told you, we can't go back. Thomas basically owns the town marshal. If he finds out I have Josie, he'll accuse me of kidnapping. He'll take her, and he'll lock me up or worse. He gestured around the cabin. This is all I have left of her. I can't lose Josie, too. Evelyn looked at the sick child, then at the desperate man. There was no good choice here. Staying meant Josie would likely die from the fever. Going back meant walking into a trap set by a powerful, ruthless man. They were caught between a sickness and a monster. But Evelyn May Porter was a woman who had spent her life making impossible choices. She had survived loss, poverty, and humiliation. She would not be broken by this. Then we don't go back for a doctor, she said, her mind racing. We go back for medicine. She remembered the general store in Bent Willow. The window had displayed patent medicines, tonics, and tinctures. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. You stay here with Josie. I'll ride in at dawn. I'm just a plain, forgotten woman. No one will notice me. I'll buy what I need and be back before noon. It was a reckless plan. If Thomas saw her, if anyone recognized her, the whole thing would fall apart. But it was a plan. It was action. It was better than sitting here, waiting for death to arrive. Caleb stared at her, a mixture of awe and terror in his eyes. He saw the iron in her spine, the unshakable resolve. She wasn't just the steady woman his brother had been looking for. She was a force of nature. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. There's a mare in the lean-to. She's fast. But Evelyn, he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a grave whisper. Be careful. My brother is a snake. He'll smile right at you while he's plotting how to ruin you. Don't trust anyone. As dawn broke, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Evelyn rode out. The air was cold and thin, biting at her cheeks. She was no expert rider, but she pushed the mare hard, fueled by a desperate urgency. When she arrived at the outskirts of Bent Willow, she dismounted, tying the horse in a thicket of mesquite before continuing on foot. She pulled her shawl low over her face, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. The town was just waking up, and she managed to slip into the general store unnoticed. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and licorice. An old man with a long white beard sat behind the counter, half asleep. Evelyn moved quickly, scanning the shelves. She found what she was looking for, a dark bottle of Dr. Miller's fever reducer and lung balsam. The label promised to cure coughs, aches, and inflammations of the chest. She grabbed 2 bottles along with a small tin of condensed milk for Josie. As she placed the items on the counter, the old man squinted at her. "You new in town, ma'am?" "Just passing through," Evelyn mumbled, keeping her head down. He grunted, taking her money. As he handed her the change, the bell above the door jingled. Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. Thomas Whitley stepped inside. He didn't see her at first. He was talking to another man, the town marshal, a big, beefy man with a drooping mustache and a cruel glint in his eye. "Still no sign of him," Thomas was saying, his voice dripping with false concern. "My brother Caleb, he's not well. Not since his fiancée Alora took her own life. I'm worried he's snapped. They say he was last seen with a baby." Elora took her own life. The words hit Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. Caleb hadn't told her that. He'd let her believe Elora had simply died. A suicide. It made the tragedy 1,000 times darker. Evelyn held her breath, trying to shrink into the shadows. But it was too late. Thomas turned and his eyes fell on her. For a split second, there was no recognition. Then his eyes narrowed. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator that has just cornered its prey. "Well, well," Thomas Whitley said, his voice dangerously smooth. "Look what we have here. The little bird who flew the coop. I was hoping I'd see you again." He took a step toward her. The marshal's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his pistol. Evelyn was trapped. Evelyn's mind raced. Panic was a wild animal clawing at the inside of her chest, but she forced it down. She had faced humiliation on the train platform. She would not show this man fear now. She clutched the paper bag containing the medicine, her only thought on getting back to Josie. "Mr. Whitley," she said, her voice surprisingly level. "I was just leaving." "Leaving?" Thomas chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. He took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close she could smell the bay rum on his skin. "I don't think so. You see, we have a problem. My poor, troubled brother has gone missing, and he's taken my infant daughter with him. The whole town is worried sick." He gestured to the marshal, who nodded grimly. It was a masterful performance. He was painting himself as the grieving father, the concerned brother. He was turning Caleb into a madman and a kidnapper. "And now you show up," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A lone woman buying medicine for a fever. It's a strange coincidence. Wouldn't you say, Marshal?" The marshal grunted in agreement, his eyes 2 hard, suspicious chips of stone. "Ma'am, I think you'd better come with us. We have some questions for you." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. If they took her, Caleb and Josie were done for. Caleb would be hunted down, and Josie would be in the clutches of this monster. She had to do something, anything. She looked past Thomas, her eyes landing on the old storekeeper. He was watching the scene unfold, his expression unreadable. She had a sudden, desperate idea. "You're mistaken," Evelyn said, forcing a confidence she didn't feel. She turned her attention to the storekeeper. "Sir, you saw me come in. I'm just a traveler. My husband and I are camped a few miles east of here. Our boy has a touch of a cough, nothing more." She was betting on the solidarity of a stranger against the town's powerful man. It was a foolish bet. The old man just stroked his beard, his eyes flicking from Evelyn to Thomas. He knew who paid the bills in this town. His silence was her death sentence. "A husband?" Thomas sneered. "That's funny. You didn't mention a husband in your letters." He reached out and snatched the bag from her hand. He pulled out one of the bottles, reading the label aloud. "Dr. Miller's Fever Reducer and Lung Balsam. For severe inflammations. A touch of a cough, you say?" He tossed the bottle to the marshal, who caught it with a meaty thud. "Looks like we've found our accomplice." Evelyn's heart sank. It was over. But then the old storekeeper finally spoke. His voice was creaky, like old floorboards. "Leave the woman alone, Thomas." Thomas Whitley froze, turning to the old man with a look of pure disbelief. The marshal looked equally stunned. "What did you say, Silas?" Thomas asked, his voice dangerously low. "I said, leave her be," Silas repeated, his gaze steady. He slowly reached under the counter. For a terrifying second, Evelyn thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick, dusty ledger. He opened it, running a gnarled finger down a page. "Let's see here," Silas mumbled to himself. "Last Tuesday, laudanum, a full bottle. Sold to you, Thomas, for your headaches. And the Tuesday before that, another bottle. You buy a lot of laudanum, almost as much as poor Laura used to." The air in the store went still and cold. The marshal shifted his weight uncomfortably. Laudanum addiction was a quiet, ugly secret in many homes. But to have it aired out like this. Thomas's face went pale, then flushed a deep, furious red. "You old fool! What are you implying?" "I ain't implying nothing," Silas said calmly, closing the ledger with a soft thud. "I'm just stating a fact. Elora was buying 2 bottles a week before she died. Said you insisted it was the only thing for her female troubles. And I know for a fact that the doctor told her to stop. Told you both it was poison for her and the baby." Every word was a hammer blow, chipping away at Thomas's carefully constructed facade. He had supplied Elora with the drug that was destroying her. Evelyn suddenly understood. Josie's sickness, the strange, unrelenting fever, the rattling in her chest. It wasn't a normal illness. The baby wasn't sick. She was in withdrawal. The realization was horrifying. Thomas hadn't just been cruel to Elora, he had actively poisoned her, and he had poisoned his own child in the womb. "That's a lie," Thomas hissed, his composure cracking. "A senile old man's fantasy." "Is it?" Silas countered. He looked directly at the marshal. "You were there, Hank. You were the one who found her. Did you see the note she left? The one Thomas here burned before you had a chance to read it?" "I saw the smoke from my window." The marshal's face was a mess of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from Silas to Thomas, his loyalty visibly wavering. He was a bully and a pawn, but he wasn't a complete fool. He was beginning to see that he had hitched his wagon to a very bad horse. Thomas saw it too. He was losing control. In a flash of rage, he lunged not at Silas, but at Evelyn. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like talons. You're with him, aren't you? You're helping him! Let her go!" A voice boomed from the doorway. Everyone turned. Caleb stood there, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. He wasn't holding a pistol. He was holding Josie, wrapped tightly in a blanket. The baby was wheezing, her face a pale bluish color. He had followed Evelyn. He had been too worried to wait. Thomas's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "Caleb, you pathetic fool. You bring my child here? To me?" "She's not your child," Caleb said, his voice shaking with a fury that seemed to come from the center of the earth. "Not anymore. You forfeited that right when you fed her mother poison." He took a step into the store, his eyes never leaving his brother's. "And you're not taking her." The standoff was absolute. 2 brothers, a terrified woman, a compromised lawman, and a dying baby, all trapped in a store that smelled of coffee and lies. But Thomas Whitley was not a man who lost. "Hank, arrest him!" Thomas screamed at the marshal, his voice shrill. "He kidnapped my daughter. Arrest him now." The marshal was paralyzed, his hand hovering over his gun. He looked at Caleb, holding the obviously sick child. He looked at Thomas, whose carefully crafted mask had slipped, revealing the monster beneath. He looked at Silas, the old storekeeper, whose quiet words held the weight of truth. And in that moment of hesitation, everything exploded. Thomas, realizing his authority had evaporated, shoved Evelyn hard against a shelf, sending jars of preserves crashing to the floor. He lunged for Caleb and the baby. "Give her to me!" he shrieked, his eyes wild. Caleb sidestepped, shielding Josie with his body. He was a rancher, strong from years of hard labor. Thomas was a businessman, soft and cruel. The fight was short and brutal. Caleb landed a single powerful punch to Thomas's jaw. The sound was like a branch snapping. Thomas staggered backward, tripping over a sack of flour, and went down hard. The bag split open, sending a cloud of white powder into the air, covering him in a ghostly shroud. He lay there stunned, sputtering in a coat of white flour. The marshal finally drew his gun, but he didn't point it at Caleb. He pointed it at the pathetic flour-dusted figure on the floor. "Thomas Whitley," the marshal said, his voice heavy with disgust. "I think you'd better come with me." The fight was over, but the battle for Josie's life had just begun. Evelyn rushed to Caleb's side. The baby's breathing was getting shallower, the wheezing sound more pronounced. "The medicine," Evelyn said, spotting the bag on the floor where she dropped it. She scrambled to get it, her hands shaking. "We need to get this into her, now." Silas, the old storekeeper, moved with surprising speed. He came around the counter, his face grim. "That patent junk won't work," he said, his voice firm. "Not for this. This is laudanum sickness. It's a devil to get out of the system." He looked at the baby, his old eyes filled with a sad wisdom. "There's only one thing that might help, but it's risky, and we have to do it now." He looked from Evelyn to Caleb. "You're going to have to trust me." There was no other choice. They were miles from real help, with a baby fading before their very eyes. Evelyn and Caleb both nodded. What followed was a blur of frantic activity. Silas directed them with the authority of a battlefield surgeon. He had them carry Josie to the back room of the store, a small, cluttered space filled with sacks of grain and barrels of pickles. He had Evelyn strip the baby down while he boiled water on a small pot-bellied stove. "We have to sweat the poison out," he explained, his voice low and urgent. He crushed a handful of mustard seed into a paste, mixing it with flour and hot water. He spread the pungent mixture onto 2 pieces of flannel. "Plasters, to open the lungs. Now hold her steady." Evelyn held the tiny, whimpering child while Silas placed the warm, stinging plasters on her chest and back. Josie cried out, a weak, kitten-like sound that tore at Evelyn's heart. "Now the bath," Silas commanded. He poured the boiling water into a small wooden tub, adding a bucket of cold water until it was just bearable to the touch. Then he added a generous splash of whiskey from a bottle he kept under the counter. "The spirit bath will draw out the fever and the toxins." Gently they lowered Josie into the water. For a moment she went limp, her body relaxing in the heat. But then she began to thrash weakly. It was a terrifying, desperate few minutes. Evelyn held her, humming a low, steady tune, the same one she'd hummed in the cabin. She poured all of her strength, all of her hope, into her touch, into her voice. Caleb stood by, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. A helpless father watching his world hang by a thread. Slowly, agonizingly, something began to change. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on Josie's forehead. Her breathing, which had been so shallow, seemed to deepen. The terrible rattling in her chest began to subside, replaced by a clearer, though still weak breath. The bluish tint around her lips faded, returning to a pale pink. After what felt like a lifetime, Silas nodded. "All right, out now." They wrapped her in a warm, dry blanket. Josie was utterly exhausted, but she was breathing. She was alive. She curled into Evelyn's arms and fell into the first peaceful, natural sleep they had seen in days. Relief washed over Evelyn so powerfully her knees went weak. Caleb leaned against the wall, covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. In the front of the store, they could hear the marshal leading Thomas away, his protests muffled and pathetic. Silas looked at the two of them, huddled together in the back room around this tiny, fragile life they had just pulled back from the brink. He saw the way Evelyn held the child, the way Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You know," the old man said, a rare small smile touching his lips. "Heard you came here to be a mother. Looks like you got the job. Just came with a bit more trouble than you bargained for." Evelyn looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. Josie's tiny hand was wrapped around her finger. She had come to the West seeking a home, a place to belong. She'd been rejected, lied to, and threatened. She'd walked through fire. But as she stood there in the dusty back room of a general store, with a grieving man at her side and a recovering infant in her arms, she realized something profound. She hadn't found the home she was looking for. She had built one. The aftermath in Bent Willow was swift and quiet. Thomas Whitley, stripped of his power and prestige, was held in the marshal's jail, awaiting the circuit judge. The story that Silas told, backed by the marshal who had finally seen the truth, was undeniable. Thomas wasn't a pillar of the community. He was a cancer. The town began to breathe easier. as if a long, low-grade fever had finally broken. Caleb and Evelyn stayed in the room above the general store for 3 days, guests of the quiet, heroic Silas. They barely left Josie's side, watching her every breath. The crisis had passed, but the child was still fragile. Evelyn cared for her with a fierce, unwavering devotion. She fed her drops of watered-down milk, bathed her, and sang to her for hours on end. In those quiet, shared moments of vigil, the walls between Evelyn and Caleb finally came down. He told her everything. He told her about Elora, a vibrant, kind woman who had been swept up by Thomas's charm and wealth. He confessed that he had known about the affair, had begged Elora to leave his brother, but she had been trapped, ashamed, and increasingly dependent on the laudanum Thomas supplied. "I found her," Caleb said one night, his voice thick with remembered pain as they sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the quiet street. "I found the note. She wrote that she couldn't live with what he'd turned her into. She begged me to save the baby, to take her far away from him. When Thomas got there, he grabbed the note and threw it in the fire. He told the marshal she was unstable, that her death was a tragic accident." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for the layers of tragedy this man had endured. He had lost the woman he loved, then had to fight his own brother for the life of her child. "He never wanted Josie," Caleb continued, his gaze fixed on the sleeping baby in the makeshift crib. "He saw her as a complication, a loose end. When he sent for you, I think he was planning on forcing you to be the child's mother, to raise his unwanted daughter while he maintained his perfect life. But when he saw you, he saw your strength. He saw you weren't some meek little mouse he could control. You were a woman, and that scared him." It was a stunning revelation. Thomas hadn't rejected her for being too old or too plain. He had rejected her for being too strong. He had looked at her and seen not a servant, but an equal, and that was the one thing he could not tolerate. The insult that had haunted her for so long was in fact a testament to her character. On the fourth day, Josie was strong enough to travel. Her eyes were bright and clear, and she even offered a weak, gummy smile when Evelyn tickled her chin. It was time to go back to the cabin. As they prepared to leave, Silas pressed a large sack of supplies into Caleb's hands: flour, beans, coffee, and a small wooden toy he'd carved himself, a tiny, smooth bird. "For the little one," he said gruffly. Evelyn turned to him, her heart full of a gratitude that words couldn't express. "I don't know how to thank you, Silas." The old man just shrugged, a hint of a smile in his eyes. "Folks round here forgot how to stand up to the likes of Thomas Whitley. You reminded us. That's thanks enough." The ride back to the homestead was different. The silence was no longer tense or watchful. It was soft, comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding. They were no longer two strangers bound by desperation. They were a family, forged in crisis, bound by the love of a child. When they arrived at the cabin, it looked different too. It no longer seemed sad and lonely. It looked like a sanctuary, a place of refuge, a home. That evening, after they had put Josie to sleep in the beautiful cradle Caleb had built for her, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple. "Evelyn," Caleb said, his voice quiet, "I know this isn't the life you signed up for. You came here for a husband, a home. I can't offer you. My heart is still a tangled mess." Evelyn looked at him, at his kind, weary face, at the strength in his calloused hands. She thought of the life she'd left in Ohio, a gray existence of sewing buttons and bearing dreams. She thought of the man she was supposed to marry, a cruel shell of a man. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had never been more at home in her entire life. "You're right, Caleb," she said softly. "This isn't the life I signed up for." She reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was rough, but his touch was gentle. "It's better." He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. In the quiet twilight, with a sleeping child dreaming inside, they sat together. Two broken people who had found a way to be whole. A woman once told she was too empty had become the heart of a home. A man who had lost everything had found a new reason to live. and a child who was born into darkness had been brought into the light. Sometimes life doesn't give us what we expect. It gives us what we need. It sends us down a rocky, dangerous path, not to break us, but to lead us to where we were always meant to be. They said she was too old for love, too late for a family, but in the quiet hush of the prairie, under a sky full of stars, she had found both. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance. It was something quieter, stronger, and more real. It was the kind of love that doesn't just happen. It's the kind of love you build. If this story reminded you that it's never too late for a new beginning, and that strength often shows up in the quietest people, let us know in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with you. And if you want more tales from the West, where hope finds a way, even in the darkest of times, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.